Good morning. We're about ready to get started. We're in Hebrews chapter 11, and we will be beginning with verse 6. I don't really have much in the way of announcements, just the usual ones that people, have been dealing with health issues. Other than that, remember VBS kicks off today, and anyone that can stay afterwards to help with decoration and stuff like that, certainly appreciate it. Is there anything else? Okay, Scott.
Would you bow with me? Heavenly Father, our great God in heaven, thank you for bringing us here another day and at this time to learn more about your word, and help us to apply what we learned to our lives. Help Ben to remember what he studied and reveal it to us so that we can understand it better, and help us all to have willing hearts to make the changes that you need us to make. Thank you for the congregation working so hard to get ready for this VBS, and please bless it and help it to be successful so we can bring more souls to become Christians, and be with everyone who is traveling and everybody that's been on the prayer list, and lay your healing hand on those that are sick, and be with those that are spiritually weak and help them to grow. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Just a reminder, next week Scott will be taking the class for a week. I'll be up at Mike and Tammy's camp, and we'll be doing a small devotional up there, it's my understanding. But anyway, Scott will be the teacher next week, and he always does a really fine job. So, Hebrews chapter 11, verse 6. And without faith it is impossible to be well-pleasing unto him, for he that cometh to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of them that seek after him. Now, faith here, there's two elements that are described here. The first one is obviously you have to believe that God actually is. There are some people out there that don't believe that there is a God, and that's, to me, is foolish, but there are some people who have that viewpoint. But with faith, you first have to believe that he is. Then there's also another part to it, that he is a morally active God, that he is a God that not only exists, but he has a standard of morality that we ascribe to. We understand that he exists, and we understand that there's a moral code that he has established that we need to try to live by. And both of those things are necessary for us to be well-pleasing unto him. Verse 7, by faith Noah, being warned of God concerning things not seen as yet, moved with godly fear, prepared an ark to the saving of his house, through which he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness which is according to faith. So we can read this account in Genesis chapter 5 and following. Noah was, I think if I remember what I studied correctly, he was about the 10th generation away from Adam, and he had descended through the lineage of Seth, and his father's name was Lamech. And God told Noah that he needed to prepare an ark, and this would have been, I'm sure, quite challenging for Noah, because at that time yet, and we can find that in Genesis chapter 2 and verses 5 and 6, there's a strong implication that it had never rained at the time of Noah, that the land was watered and the plants and such got their water from dew that came up out of the ground. And so Noah is told to build an ark. And it was a long time. I think it was something like 100 years or something like that. It was a long time that he was doing all this preparation. And I want you to take a minute and just think back through the last 10, 20 years of your life. Don't that seem like a fair amount of time? Oh, he would have been at this ark thing for a long time. Day after sunny day, you know what I mean? And the faith and persistence that he must have demonstrated was incredible to me, you know? And you could imagine other people, hey, looks like rain today. You know, I just could imagine the abuse that he took, you know? And, you know, but he stayed with it. And that shows the faith and the perseverance that he had. And I can't even imagine all of like we understand, you know, that he took all the different kinds of animals into the ark. There's more to that preparing all the food that each one of them would have needed to sustain themselves through, I don't know, was it a month or so that, you know, that the ark was not on dry land? It was a while until the waters receded from the earth. There was a lot going on there, you know, and he had to prepare all that. And obviously there had to been some miraculous stuff going on there too, because I can't imagine some of the animals getting along, quote unquote, you know. Maybe he had some separation, I don't know. But certainly you wouldn't have put some of the animals in with the lions. That wouldn't have worked out very well for you, you know. And to do all those things, it took an incredible amount of faith. And I try to even think about the people that was making fun of him probably the whole time. You know, when it actually started, I try to imagine what they must have thought, like, wow, he was right, you know, type thing. And I could quite imagine some of them tried to go and attach themselves to the ark somehow. And it would have came on them suddenly. And calamity sometimes works that way with people. You know, I can remember years ago, it's a long time ago, Logan was just a baby at the time. Julie and Tom were coming home to spend a long weekend. And they were just driving along like nothing has happened. Less than a mile later, for when they were talking about what they were going to do, head-on collision, you know, life flights and all that stuff. Calamity just can come like that, and that's probably what happened in Noah's generation. It started raining, and the fountains of the deep opened up, and they weren't laughing anymore, you know. And I think all of us have to be prepared for when that day comes, because for all of us, you know, some of us will have warning, some of us will have diseases and other things that we recognize are going to, you know, be the downfall of us. But for some people, it's like that. So we have to be prepared all the time, you know, recognizing that, you know, we don't know when our last day is. And we never know when's the last gospel sermon that we will hear, our last opportunity to respond to a message. We just don't know that. And so I think all of us need to be constantly reflecting on that. Behold, today is the day of salvation, is what the Bible teaches us. So we need to be worried about that. Now, I'm interested, too, in where it says that Noah moved with godly fear. And that is a reaction to God that's reasonable. There's really three biblical reasons that people respond to God, and it's the love of God, there's the hope of reward. We respond to him because of that, because we love him. But there's also a fear component. And a godly fear, that doesn't mean that we fear him in the same way that, say, the German people feared Hitler, thought of him as somebody that wasn't even fair in the process, that he was coming for them. And he really had reason to have fear because it didn't matter, what you were like as a person. But with God, we can legitimately fear him in the sense that people sometimes young children can, fear their parents in the sense, not that they don't realize that they don't love them, but they know that here's the line you don't cross, and sometimes young people need to learn what those lines are. And the same thing is true for us. We have this godly fear that motivates us to try to be better because we do realize that there is a penalty for those who refuse to obey God, and it's not a good one. And I find it interesting, too, where it says Noah prepared an ark. So it was more than just he believed what God said. He also obeyed and followed the orders for its construction. And like we talked about before, that wasn't any minor task. Scott's been building a house here recently. Now imagine an ark that's way bigger than that. There's a lot goes into that, right? Yeah, a lot goes into it. And so faith requires more than just believing that something is going to happen or that something exists. Faith means that you respond to it and you actually do things. Noah responded to God's warning by preparing an ark. And I think, that is important too. Then it goes on to say that through which he condemned the world. Because while he was doing that, we learned that he was preaching to them, even though they were unbelieving. And I'm sure, like we talked about before, he was getting ridiculed, I would quite imagine, for doing just that. And it goes on to say that he became the heir of righteousness, which is according to faith. And if you think about it, he became an heir of righteousness because of his faith. And even someone like godly Noah was not sufficiently good of his own accord to be saved, or his own works or merit. His faithful obedience to what God told him to do is what made him the heir of righteousness. Okay, any thought or comment in any of that in verse 7? Yeah, Scott. It's on its way.
I just wanted to point out that fear, biblical fear, isn't always the fear that we kind of have in our mind. It's the greatest form of respect. God can destroy your soul. But, and that's the only being that's going to destroy your soul. If you don't respect him, you're going to end up that way. You're going to end up lost. So, a lot of people see that word fear and they don't correlate respect with fear. You look at little kids. Some kids don't fear their parents. You don't have any respect there either. You just see it. They don't listen. They don't do whatever. You can look at Alvin sometimes and see that. that, he's not afraid. Sometimes you have to teach him that maybe he should be afraid. But you see what I'm saying? Like, you gotta fear God, because the end result isn't, appealing.
Yeah. Jesus himself says, don't fear him who can kill the body, but fear him who can kill both the body and soul in Hades. So I think having a certain amount of legitimate fear is good. Any other? Yeah, Steve.
Thinking about
It's on its way.
I guess this is off the subject because this is thinking about Noah and the ark. But, we usually think of this as a sailing ship, and shaped like a boat. But it doesn't say that, and it's not going anywhere. I mean, it's just floating. And it's a pretty good size ship.
I would think so.
If you can call it a ship, it's an ark. And so it probably is more shaped like a barge.
That would be my take, yes.
But it's probably one of the biggest of its kind. And who knows where it was built? It doesn't say it was built in a harbor. He's building it out in the middle of a field somewhere, and so he'd be ridiculed because, well, where's the water? But this is a good size ark. Other arks were square, so I don't know, the Ark of the Covenant and such like. So it's just a something that will float, okay? And so I can imagine the amount of ridicule he would get for building this thing out in the middle of the field somewhere, or even in the woods where the wood was. But he was building this, and so he would get quite a bit of ridicule, I would think.
Oh, I would quite imagine, especially with the passage of time. It's been 30 years, oh, brother, what do you, type thing. I could imagine that that's the kind of thing that would have happened. Yeah, Billy.
I want to say something about cubits. It's so many cubits this way, so many cubits that way. I can kind of give you an idea of what it looks like, right?
Yeah, I didn't look into that, but suffice to say, like Steve said, it would have been,
18 inches is a cubit.
what's that?
18 inches.
Yeah, 18 inches is a cubit. It was originally meant to, a cubit back in the old time was like from the tip of your fingers to the elbow type thing, and that's about 18 inches. That was what they thought, and so it was gonna be big. As for Steve's idea that the shape of it need not really be like a standard sailing vessel, more like a barge, I think that's right. The only key thing it really needed was to be able to float, and I would think it talks about sealing it with pitch, and that's like a tarry type substance, and as long as you could seal compartments off, and keep air in it, it'll float, it would stay up, and so I think that was part of the process as well. Anything else? Okay. Verse 8, by faith Abraham, when he was called, obeyed to go out unto a place which he was to receive for an inheritance, and he went out not knowing whither he went. Man, I find that challenging. I'm a person, I like to know what I'm going to do ahead of time. You know what I mean? I'm not one of these people that, I get that being spontaneous sometimes is all right and fun and all that. But for important things, I like to know what it is I'm going to do. And so God approaches Abraham. He says, okay, I want you to pack up your family, your servants, all that, and leave. And I'll tell you where later. Say what? You know, that for someone like me, that'd be tough. What do I need to pack? You know, or are we talking cold weather here? Or are we, you know, is there lots of water there? You know, when he was told to leave, he didn't realize it was going to be Palestine. He didn't know. And that's challenging to me. Sometimes faith calls us to do things that are scary, you know, and I think it's amazing. I would personally find that really hard. I hope I could do it. We don't do the same things. We don't communicate with God the same way as the patriarchs, but I would like to think I could have somehow responded to that, but it wouldn't have been easy. You know, this, if you think about it, and Lockyer noted that in one of the things he wrote. He says, Abraham's place in the Bible gallery is altogether unique and unapproachable. He stands out as a landmark in the spiritual history of the world. Chosen of God to become the father of a new spiritual race, the final leader of a mighty host, the revelation of God found in him, one of its most important chapters. And I think that's true, you know. And it says, by faith, Abraham, when he was called, he obeyed. So God says, pack up, you're leaving. And he did it. Okay. You know, that'd be tough. And I think of folks, well, Clem, like your in-laws, you know, they just figured out one day that they were going to Africa. There had to have been a lot of unknowns there. And I find that really impressive. And I've actually communicated that to them. You know, that taking on something like that, and I'm sure Brian knows some, what's the guy's name? It's a fan of Ohio State that him and I got into it over there. Yeah. Look at what he did. Just pack up and go. And you can't possibly know all the things that you're in for. You just go. And I find that challenging. I find that I'd like to think I could do that better, you know? But that's when faith, when the rubber really meets the road of faith, is taking leaps of faith like that call for a lot of trust, not just a little, a whole bunch of trust. I think of when Clarence McDowell, he would think of what he did. Really think, he was the superintendent of Franklin Steel. Superintendent, big bucks, stable career, everything. I'm going to quit all that to become a preacher. That's really something. You know, and for some of us, I'd like to think we could do things like that. Maybe some of us have some room to grow in our faith. I don't know that I'm there, you know, but just something to think about. Any thought or comment on any of this? Okay. Yeah, in a sense, where it talks about he went out not knowing whither he went, you hate to use the term blind faith, but in this case it sort of applies. He had no clue, you know, of what he was going to do, but he knew God that told him to do it, so he was going to do it. You know, and we need to have that kind of response. If God says to do something, we have to trust him to do it. You know, even if maybe sometimes we're not sure where we're going to go with it. I think about the woman that Jesus singled out that she just threw a little bit, but she threw everything she had into the collection of the treasury. You know, and sometimes we're called to give, and we're called to, and sometimes when the end of the month is still a little further out than the money, you know, we're called to have trust and to give even when we're not sure what that all means. Okay, Kathy first, then Val.
Excuse me, on a much lesser scale, of course, there were circumstances that came up that when I was initially going through a whole bunch of medical problems and I wasn't able to live in what was my current situation, I was told, I felt this inner power telling me to, you know, come up here. I knew nobody but my daughter up here. I was leaving my sister behind, whom I know still desperately needs me. But in a sense, I was leaving a big chunk of my family and friends. But circumstances and whatever you want to call them led me up here. And I had to start over. I had to, you know, leave my kids and pray that they would be okay.
That would be tough.
And you know, and I mean, my sister is in like still desperate need, and I wish I could be there, but I can't. But that's a whole other story. Anyway, I didn't know if my kids were even going to be okay. You know, they both have intellectual disabilities. I didn't know if they were even going to be, if I taught them well enough to be able to support themselves. You know. Their dad didn't have too much involvement, so I mean, I felt, of course, on a much lesser scale than what Abraham and such, but it was still a major move for me. But God has rewarded me in so many ways, you know, and it was what I was supposed to do. I was called to this church. I found a wonderful man who loves me to death, and I have a wonderful place to live, and I have a whole new family. So, I mean, just listening to God and to those inner feelings, and being scared and having that fear ended up being the most wonderful thing in the world. Yeah, my sister still needs me, and I'm trying to be there, but my kids are thriving. So
There you go. And then to Val, one of the things I'll say while he's taking the microphone up there is God sometimes can surprise us with what lies at the end of the journey. Sometimes the journey is not always easy, and sometimes the journey has challenges with it. But then at the end, sometimes there's blessings we could never have imagined. I think I would have liked to have been I don't know what, I guess a mouse in the corner or whatever it was, you know, when Mary comes to the tomb, you know, and she's probably very sorrowful and everything. And then all of a sudden, Jesus, there's surprise, you know. I wonder how she would have, I'd have liked to have seen it, put it that way. Valerie.
Back in Abraham's time, you know, he had the faith and God told him what to do. And now that God doesn't speak directly to us, he does present us with opportunities.
He certainly does.
And we need to have the faith to take advantage of those opportunities. Like say, like out of the blue, like a job offer comes and you're not even hunting for one, or, you know, and it's like we just have to have the faith that this is where God wants us to be because he has presented that opportunity to us, as long as it's in accordance with his will, of course.
Yeah, I remember, and Steve and Pat, remember when your job changed out here and all of a sudden, now what? You know, and you guys were thinking about moving, you were thinking about starting a business, just all kinds of things that, you know, where does God want us to be type thing. And I remember some of the conversations and thinking about that. So it happens. It's real stuff that we all end up facing at one time or another. And being able to trust through tough times, you know, is hard, you know, and sometimes, you know, health issues, you know, can come up and really call us to have a lot of faith. Is this going to work out? Sure don't seem like it right now. Is it going to work? And then when it does, it's like, wow, you know, and I think that's great. Anything else? Now in verse 9 it says, and here I believe is actually one of the keys to it all. By faith he became a sojourner in the land of promise, as in a land not his own, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with them of the same promise. He saw himself as a sojourner, that he was on a trip through this life, that this wasn't his permanent home, you know? And boy, that's the kind of thing that hits at some of us if we think about it, you know, because a lot of people build their dream home and everything in this world, you know what I mean? And they build up their equity and everything, and we act like this is going to be our final home, you know? And somehow, I think deep down we know it, but it's just hard to internalize it, that whatever we have here, we can't take with us. I remember a black preacher that I heard up when we visited Julie one time up in Long Island, and he was there. He had a statement, and I've never forgot it because it really hit home. He says, he is yet to see a hearse with a U-Haul attached to it. And I thought, yep, that's about right, you know. And so, really, if you think about it, the only real things you can accumulate that will last is any teaching or things that you do that cause other people to one day be in heaven with you. That's the only real treasure that you take from here. Is the legacy, you know, that others will join you there. That's it, you know, and I've come to understand that more in recent years, and that more of the teaching, visiting type things, is that understanding, because the more years you put under your belt, the more you begin to understand that the sand in the hourglass is just, there's more in the bottom now than there is in the top, you know, and you start understanding that, you know, all the stuff that's sitting around in the back garage and everything like that, most of which I don't even use anymore, does it really matter? And ultimately it don't. You know, we think it does, but it just don't. In the long, you know, we tend to build our castles, we tend to, you know, look at the bank accounts and all the other things. And you have to do that to live. I'm not getting down on anybody about, you have to do that to live, but ultimately that's not the final destination. We're just sojourners in this land. That's all it is. And part of that is why Abraham could leave. He was a very wealthy man, by the way. That's why he could leave his family, some of his relatives, and everything in that land, and move out, as he didn't see anything as his permanent home. And by the way, he was a sojourner even in Palestine when he went there. He didn't own any property. The only thing that I think we could say that he owned was the cave at Machpelah where he buried his wife. I think that's it. I'm not sure that he ever had any real possessions there. He was just always moving around in tents and everything. And look at that attitude. You know, for some of us, that's tough, right? That concept. We want to have, this is mine. You know, we like to think in terms like that. But even when we own something, really God's just given it to us in rental, isn't he, sort of? You know? And I forget where it's at in Psalms, I think somewhere. It says, the cattle of 1,000 hills belong to the Lord. So we think we possess this or that. We actually don't. We have it on loan, and he's blessed us with it, and that's great, and we should be thankful. But what do we really have that we can take with us? Any thought or comment? Yeah, Scott.
Stephanie and I were just talking, what do you really own? Do you own your soul? Not really, no. Do you own none of your property? Nothing. Like, who owns that cave you just mentioned now? Who owns it? We don't know. But what do we carry with us? Our sin. It's the only thing. And we can't even get rid of that. We need Jesus to get rid of that. That's the only thing you really own.
It's the way it is. And, you know, sometimes people can really get bent out of shape when life situations attack that equity that they've built up. You know what I mean? I heard a story one time, a preacher talked about, they was watching a little boy, you know, that was on vacation. He was at the beach. And he built up this big fort in the sand and spent all day, you know, working on it and building up this fort and everything. And then the tide came in, and a big wave came in and just knocked it all down. He was standing there laughing and clapping. And he says, think about adults when those type things happen and their forts get knocked down, you know, and the bank account takes a big hit because of things that they didn't expect and everything. You know, certainly don't react like the little boy did. It's like calamity time, and now what? And see, all these things point to the faith that we're supposed to have. You know, we sure like to build our castles here. And people try to immortalize themselves, especially wealthy people, you know, like Carnegie Library and, you know, Mellon this and Rockefeller Center and all the different things. They try to find meaning and long-term identity in this world, and it just doesn't exist. Oh, people remember things, but you know, I was reflecting, not too long ago. It was actually on Mother's Day. I stopped I visited my mom the only way I could. Went to the cemetery, you know. And I was just there thinking, how many people have tombstones here that haven't been visited in how long? People even remember people that died over 100 years ago. Does anybody ever remember? Ultimately, your identity will leave this earth and won't. After 100 years or so, no one will know that you was even here. That's sort of a bummer to think about it like that, but it's sort of true. The only real lasting thing you have is if you have a name written in that book of life. And if you have that, then that matters. That's what really matters. Jesus talked about, setting up treasures for yourself in heaven, because those are the ones that will last. Okay, any thought or comment? Okay. In verse 10 it says, "For he looked for a city that hath foundations, whose builder and maker is God." And really, what is that city that God builds? We see that in Revelation chapter 21 and verse 2. That eternal city that cometh down from God out of heaven. And it's called the heavenly Jerusalem. That home will last. Jesus said, "In my Father's house are many rooms." Sometimes the King James, I think, has it translated mansions. I think rooms is a better translation. But the idea is there will actually be something that a place that you can have your own to stay and everything. You will have a room there, and it won't go away. Heaven's where we'll finally be at that place where we actually will have our final roots and everything can stay. And Scott and I have talked about this, me doing flipping houses and him working on building a new one and everything. The concept of a building being square, it's almost not really possible, right? It's close. But I remember going into some houses to try to put in countertops and stuff like that. What a disaster. You have to shim this and all kinds of stuff, And I think it'll be good to have a place where we're going to be able to stay that God's the builder of it, Because stuff that we build tends to, it can look nice for a while, but it shifts and everything else. And I think I'd like a house that he built.
Insurance, fire insurance, flood insurance.
I like that. I like that. In verse 11 it says, "By faith even Sarah herself received power to conceive seed when she was past age, saying she counted him faithful who had promised." Now, Sarah ends up in the Hebrews chapter of faith, but in fairness, at first she didn't believe it too much, did she? When she first heard it, yeah, right. This ain't happening, because she was way past the time when she could legitimately conceive children. And probably Abraham couldn't have pulled it off either, very unlikely at his age. So, there's a lot of things that had to happen. She didn't believe it until the angel himself sort of said that this was going to happen and pointed out to her, "Look, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, yeah, that's crazy." And when that happened, then she actually said, "Okay, well, maybe this can happen." And by faith, she accepted it, and it did happen. And it looks like we're out of time. So, Scott, you got it next week, and we'll go from there.